We have an exciting technological innovation here in that due to flights from Paris being very French, there is one of our speakers is still in Europe and is going to be up on the big screen for us later on. But we're going to start with Juan Sola, who's a law professor in Argentina. He's director of the Center for Law and Economics at the University of Buenos Aires. I'm sure a lot of you know him anyway. Certainly if you've been to one of these conferences before, you do. He's going to tell us about the religious origins, not of individualism, but of its antithesis, corporatism.
I have to thank you for a very kind invitation. I'm extremely proud to speak to you after hearing so elegant speakers in the morning and especially at lunch. This is a study on failure. I'm going to start with a sad moment, speaking about why symptom theology and religious belief were an attack on capitalism and individuality. Slaves are we of defunct economists, but also of defunct theologians, as Keynes is always remembered saying. I agree very much with the speaker over lunch that Max Weber was perhaps near the truth, but not in the truth. But we was in something in the truth, that the enemy of capitalism was created in a theological debate, not perhaps in Luther, but in its opponents. The main opponent to Luther was, of course, Counterformation. Counterformation was a great effort that lasted in general between the Council of Trent and the end of the war, the 30 Years' War. And it's a movement, a very strong movement, that wanted to regulate every aspect of human activity. Architecture, of course theology, of course the way of teach religion, but especially art, music, literature, and politics, and the way you see society. The results of the Counter-Reformation are, in a way, modern corporatism. It is true, in a way, to repeat what was already said, that individualism existed before Luther. May I quote several, at least two very, very important actors, which were not Germans. One was Piccolo della Mirandola, a man of a prodigious memory, and that spoke in this magnificent book about the dignity of man, I suppose a person meaning, not only man, the right to discrepancy, but especially this point that a good life is lived in differentiation, not in unity. That if you want to create art, music, literature, you have to be different from the rest. New things, new ideas are to be accepted if you want to have any progress. Then there is another Italian, also at the 15th century, it is before the 16th century, which is Lorenzo Valla. Lorenzo Valla was a theologian. He was the first who attacked firmly and in a very elegant way. It was in a homage to St. Thomas Aquinas, but he attacked the St. Thomas Aquinas philosophy, scholasticism, because he said there is no real progress in the new world unless you bring new ideas, new ways of thinking. Unless you don't know scholastics, you debate one point, pro and against, and never get out of that. You cannot allow to bring new information unless, of course, the classics are introduced. And that way was, of course, St. Thomas Aquinas was already dead philosophy by the 16th century. It had dead for 300 years, but it was brought to Trento near to the Bible. So in the Trento Council, you found the Bible, nothing of sola scriptura, who was mentioned a minute ago, but it was also the works of St. Thomas Aquinas, especially the Summa Theologica. Well, Piccolo del Milandra was poisoned, so it's not sometimes so easy to fight for new ideas. And then, of course, we have this angry Augustinian monk we heard a lot about Luther. Let me point things that I think were extremely useful for new ways of thinking. First, the idea of individualism, because he had this, he didn't say it in 500 years ago, but in some memoirs written later, but all men, all baptized men were priests. This means that you break one of the main points of corporatism, which is hierarchy, and then a unity of thought. So every man, because he's baptized, could have a legitimate way of giving an opinion on the scriptures. Anyone could have an opinion. But it also, I think, his main point was he has no system. He didn't create a structured church. He created a rather disorganized, informal way of seeing religion. And in that way, I agree that Luther, but perhaps without thinking of it, created the basis of pluralism, the basis that you could think differently, that you could read your own scriptures or read other things. But this year is also a great anniversary that you didn't forget, of course, but you could have remembered. It's the 500 years of the Republican book by Niccolò Machiavelli. Of course, you know The Prince, 1513, but in 1517 he wrote this, I think, the main book, The Discourses of the 10 Decades of Roman History by Titus Livius, Livy, I think it's said in English. This is the major source on republicanism. Machiavelli was the first Republican in the modern era. Of course, there were Republicans in ancient times, but that was part of ancient history, a classic opinion. He had several points that were very strong, and they were very well read, especially on the 18th century onwards. First, a republic could be defined to a place where one could not be, or should not be afraid of for oneself. You're not going to be persecuted. This, said in the middle of the Renaissance, was a fantastic idea. You needn't be afraid if you live in a community. You are not going to be persecuted if you think differently. Then innovation. Fortune, for Machiavelli, said, fortune is a woman, so she can be convinced by the audacious, by the active, for what you call entrepreneurs now. So we could change our destiny by our own doings. It's not written for us. Why I mention Machiavelli? Because in Counterformation he was anathema. He had the same standing as Luther. Especially the Jesuit, sorry, I'm terrible with accents. The Jesuit theologians took a whole century writing against Machiavelli. At the same time, here they wrote very actively against Luther. So since you are defined by your enemies as much as you are defined by your friends, I think that Luther and Machiavelli, in a way, could be considered jointly in this endeavor. Why are we speaking theology when we should be speaking of economics and political science? Because theological arguments are so strong. They endure much more than any other argument. It is one thing to say, this is my opinion, or this is the opinion of Aristotle, or this is the opinion of someone else, than saying, this is God's opinion. I enter into a different realm. So I not only be contrary to other people's opinions, I will be contrary to the institution, the church opinion. So with Luther, there was this idea that you could debate, dissent, read a different book while reading the Bible, exercise, in a way, free will. But in the Counterformation, the church changed. Before the Counterformation, there was certain free will accepted, since the Pope was the master of the universe, the vicar of Christ in any aspect, never discussed about. Of course, there were discussions, the conciliar movement, Jan Hus, and all that, but basically the authority was unchallenged. So you could paint as you, in a way, like, and use architecture, literature in a more open way. But with the Counter-Reformation, that freedom ended, and with that entered a very strong rigidity. Let us speak a bit of the Council of Trent. 18 years, the longest council in history. Basically a Spanish affair. Dominican and afterwards Jesuit theologians wrote this new activity. They regulated every human activity, and the one they didn't regulate, they allowed the Pope to regulate afterwards, to create these institutions. They had extraordinary changes. One was the creation, also by Spaniards, as a matter of fact, of my own neighborhood, historically. In Spain, Basques, in the company of Jesus. The company Jesus had was the army of the Pope. The army of the church. When I mean the army, it was literally called an army. It was created by a soldier and a great preacher, St. Francis Xavier and Ignatius Loyola. In English, it's always difficult. The fourth vow was a direct vow of obedience to the Pope. So they were separate from any other authority, not even from the ordinary, that is a bishop. Let me indicate certain points which I think are very surprising for creating a very corporatist and closed society. First, they rediscovered a new philosophy, the revival of Thomism, the St. Thomas Aquinas. Neo-Thomism was, to this day, the official philosophy of not only the church, of many philosophical institutions, that was called the philosophia perennis, the perennial philosophy that cannot be changed, cannot be attacked, unless if you do, you attack the institution. Saint Robert Bellarmine, this is a particular, a Jesuit saint. He was not active in Trent, but he applied Trent. You may remember him. He was the one who burnt Giordano Bruno. He was the one who convinced Galileo that he was mistaken, or else. There were other curiosities. He was not made a saint and a doctor of the church in the 16th or 17th century like Ignatius Loyola. He was made in 1930 by Pius XI in the moment that the official doctrine of the church was basically unity. There is a twist of history. An Argentine cardinal, Jesuit, was named cardinal under his advocation. Now a bishop, fortunately for all of us, is the Pope. The main criticism he made for the Lutherans was, you're making the church invisible. You're destroying hierarchy, and destroying hierarchy, you will no longer have a unified church. And if you don't have a unified church, it's impossible, it's non-existent. Reality is the opposite. Having, in a way, a disorganized organization, you could create new ideas, innovation, change, and in a way, develop. Perfect. I think I'm right. He was also many others, the creation of the Holy Office. The Holy Office is Inquisition. No? The Index, prohibited books. The nihil obstat means no objection to publication. No? Let me take you one of the main ideas of corporatism, which is generally forgotten, which is unity. Unity, why? The theological idea is very simple. One God, one church, credo in unum Deum, one church, holy, Catholic, and apostolic. Not only the Catholics, it's only the credo for everyone. This idea of the unity, which exists in corporatism to this day, the debate in Spain this week, you see the idea of unity very actively brought, is the antithesis of the contractarian state that we more or less accept. Curious enough, it was the Jesuits who invented the contractarian state, Suarez. But they thought of a contractarian state where God gave the power to the people as a unity, as a metaphysical concept, and the people to the king. So in that way, you could control religiously, even political power. The other point is, of course, hierarchy. Why? Because if you don't accept hierarchy, you are in error. If you bring new ideas, you end up making a mistake, because the church has the truth. If the church has the truth, you can no longer be in the truth if you don't accept their ideas. So in a way, makes the individual invisible. The perennial philosophy. One more important thing that I would like to debate very quickly. One is the limits of human science. Theologians till the 19th century said, intellect is weak. So you shouldn't trust your intellect. You shouldn't trust the truth. Not only theological, the one you read is covered, because that is your guide. And the other thing is the common good. Of course, nobody's against the common good. It depends how you define it. We could vote for the common good and take a decision, or perhaps someone else could tell us with authority. And that is the main problem. So we have this great question. Well, there is natural law. Natural law is very important as a definition because it's a source of legitimacy. Positive law has to be, again, in agreement with natural law. If you're against natural law, you are not legitimate. Well, that is a very... And then there is a book that I will recommend if you like to see this comparison. A book never quoted by Max Weber, a great Spanish philosopher, still printed to this day in Spanish and in English. You can find it in English too. Jaime Balmes wrote a comparison between Catholicism and Protestantism, which is of course ridiculous. I mean, because it's false in a way, but it's this idea that you have to create an authoritarian society because in the end, republicanism is Protestant. You can imagine such a stupid thing to say. But anyway, if your intellect is personally weak, you need a guide. In a way, all these ideas are ancient theological. Nobody follows them anymore, I would say. But it was the basis of the close corporatist society. So in a way, it was not much Luther who created individual, I would say. It was their enemies that created a strong institutional culture and, in a way, condemned the countries that followed to live in economic stagnation. So now we live in the jumble of corporatism. Very old ideas that are being refurbished. Curiously enough, we spoke with Professor Mackintosh yesterday. You could be a corporatist left or right. You could be a man of religion, or you could be a man against religion. But the curious is that you deny competition, you deny new ways of thinking, you deny innovation, and basically you deny individualism. Thank you very much.
We're now going to move on to more pure economics, I suppose, with Joachim Voth, who's an economics professor at the University of Zurich, and he specializes in the area of economics that's my favorite, which is economic history. An economist might actually have some chance of getting something right when they look at history. It's very hard when they're looking at the future. Now, he's going to take us through how individualism contributed to the development of capitalism. Some of this will be familiar to you, some of it won't. And I think also point out that, of course, individualism isn't the only thing that matters here.
Okay, well, thank you so much for that kind introduction. Thank you all for being here. I'm going to talk about the evolution of individual values, some of them touching on individualism, and then also trying to look at factors that might have influenced the degree of individualism as we see it today. So just to start and make sure that we're all on the same page, there's some wonderful work that a Dutch sociologist started to do when he was working for IBM by the name of Geert Hofstede. And he conducted surveys amongst the employees of IBM, and this later became a big research project, and he gave them lots of questionnaires and found reliable differences in attitudes. And one of the dimensions that he's interested in is actually individualism, the thing that we're talking about today. So if you actually look at this map here, the more red it is, the more individualistic people are. and the more green it is, the less individualistic people are. So this is based on a set of 5 questions, whether people have loyalty to a group versus do they choose their own friends, do they follow conventions, or do they make their own choices, do they care mostly what others think, or do they think that they should live by their own rules and objectives, do they think that promotion based on loyalty and age is okay, or should you only be promoted for competence, and so on. So if you contemplate this map for a second, it's fairly clear that the only corners of the globe that are really truly individualistic are either European or European offshoots, areas settled by Europeans, and then there are gradations in the rest of the world. So since unfortunately Gert Hofstede was not around in the year 1500 or the year 1000, we don't really have snapshots of how this map of the world would have looked in the past. So I'll be reduced to some structured speculations on which of these aspects are actually new and which of these actually have deeper antecedents and might have been there in the more distant past. Before I go there, let me just show you why it matters. So this is from the work of Gérard Roland and Yuri Gornichenko. If you actually take this Hofstede index of individualism and you plot it against our favorite measure of economic performance, GDP per capita, you can see this satisfyingly upward sloping line, meaning that those places that are more individualistic actually produce much more per capita than the countries that have more collectivist values, if you will. Now, of course, just looking at this doesn't tell you that this is causal. It could well be that once you get rich, you actually allow yourselves the pleasure of individualistic attitudes, and as long as you're poor, you have different sets of beliefs. But I'm not going to pull out a magic rabbit and tell you which one it is, and instead I'd like to offer a couple of speculations of how we got to this state of affairs where some corners of the world look so much more individualistic than others. Okay, so here you see some Greek foot soldiers, hoplites, going into battle. And if there's one thing you notice here, these are what they call phalanx, men fighting side by side. And what they do with their shields is to protect each other. So one of the earliest examples of truly individualist attitudes goes back to a Greek poet and mercenary by the name of Archilochos, writing in 670. And he says, "Some Scian mountaineer struts today with my shield. I threw it down by a bush and ran when the fighting got hot. Life seemed more precious. It was a beautiful shield. I know where I can buy another, exactly like it, just as round." So Greek mothers used to tell their children to only come back from battle either on the shield, meaning dead, or with a shield. And that's because you protect the next man right next to you by carrying the shield and not letting it drop. And Archilochos, in a poem that probably didn't advertise his services as a mercenary, says, "To hell with all of that. I don't care. The battle was too hot, and I'm here to fight another day." So there's clearly something in this tiny corner of the Eurasian landmass that as early as 670 years before Christ marks people out as particularly individualistic. Now, if you actually look for other ingredients in the pot, we heard a lot of things about how Lutheranism furthered individualism and so forth, but there is actually something incredibly important, I think, that we haven't heard about, which is the act of marriage and what it tells us about the role of women. So I think the last progressive thing the Catholic Church did was to decide in the Middle Ages that marriage requires an act of the will, not just by the man, but by the woman as well. So for St. Augustine, this was new. He thought that women could be married by their fathers, whether they liked it or not. By the time of Pope Nicholas in 866, this is already part of religious doctrine. It becomes written into the canon by the Fourth Lateran Council in 1215. So for half of mankind, this is an incredible discontinuity that in order to be validly married, you actually have to make an individual decision that is not forced on you, and that before God, it is only the act of two wills that will make for a valid marriage. Okay? We have some other factors that probably go into the mix. So these are different family types in Europe. I'm not going to bore you with all the details, but Europeans do something that's extremely rare in the rest of the world, which is to move out of the parental household in many cases. This is what you see as the absolute nuclear families here, and set up a new shop. You don't move in with your in-laws, but you actually found a new family on your own. And then some of this is even privileged in the sense that the oldest son inherits everything and not in others. And as you can see, for example, parts of Scandinavia, Denmark, and England actually have this absolute nuclear family type, and those are actually the areas in Europe where you're going to find very high levels of individualism today. All right. Now, there's something quite beautiful in recent research that tries to tell us more about where individualist values come from. And Nan and Giuliano look at the World Values Survey, and they look at basically the inverse of individualism, what I just told you about, the importance of tradition. Tradition is important to this person to follow the family customs handed down by one's religion or family. You score it on a scale from 1 to 6, and this is probably the exact inverse of what I just showed you. And they say, where does it come from? Why do you sometimes care a lot what your parents tell you and sometimes a little? And I think the answer is quite interesting. What they argue is this reflects a reaction to temperature variability. So if the environment changes dramatically, between the one that your parents grew up in and the one that you grew up in, then the value of just copying what your parents did is very low. Your parents and grandparents can't tell you how to do things right. You have to figure it out yourself. If temperature variability is low, then the best thing you can do is just to copy what the last generation has done and the one before. So we have actually good historical data on temperature variability. We have things like the Little Ice Age and periods of relatively greater heat. And Nan and Giuliano basically produce this map here and then show you that the importance of tradition in societies today is negatively influenced by having greater climate instability in the past. So every time somebody tells you that global warming is a terrible thing, you should say, yes, but, maybe it actually helps you think for yourself instead of just copying what everybody else told you. So there's a silver lining to everything. All right, so let me touch briefly on something that Peter Jungen has already covered probably more competently than I have. So there's the famous Weber hypothesis, often misunderstood, has this belief that it is because success is seen as a sign of having been chosen, Protestants work harder and do the right economic thing. Weber actually said it mostly for dissenting religious sects in England and not so much about Luther as such. And there's an outpouring of work on the topic, some of it I think are more misguided than others. The interesting thing is that there's a very insightful paper that says, let's look at what's actually going on and see whether the channel is truly this work ethic or it's something else. So what Weber probably saw was something like this when he wrote. So if he'd been able to use Excel to do a scatter plot, he could have shown you something like this. You see the share of Protestants in 1900 ranging from 0 to 100% on the x-axis, and then GDP in 1900 on the y-axis. And basically the only countries that are rich are very, very Protestant, and the countries that are really, really poor basically have no Protestants in them. So Max Weber, with his Excel sheet that he didn't have, can be forgiven for being misguided. But maybe what's going on is that it's all about education, because you have to, as a good Christian, be able to read, and then it's just you and the scripture. And that's why in one of his writings to the councilmen of all cities in Germany, he actually tells them that they should establish Christian schools, and of course, having just expropriated the monasteries, they actually flush with cash and do precisely that. And this is what it does. The literacy rate that you can see here on the y-axis does the same thing as the income per capita that you saw one slide ago. So Becker and Wössmann take this to within Germany variation, just looking at Prussia, and show you that it's exactly this. It's not that the Protestants are richer, it's that the Protestants are more literate, and hence they're richer. That's what's actually going on, and it has this element of religiously inspired activity that then maps into economic outcomes, but for a very different reason. Now, let me skip this. Let me talk about one more thing that I think has changed dramatically in the last 500 years, for which we have some data, which is that people have become less violent. And that's not just a result of different attitudes, though I think that's part of it, but it's an interaction between how people behave and what the state can do. We have large states that successfully assert the monopoly of violence. that is recent in mankind's history. 500 years ago, European states were a joke and no more capable than, say, the Chinese state. And by 1900, they were incredibly impressive. Pretty much everyone agrees that that's partly a result of continuous warfare, or as Charles Tilly said, states made war, but war also made states. And one of the things that the religious Reformation does is to create warfare in early modern Europe like in no other time in human history. So for every 100 years in the early modern period, there's about 150 years of great power wars. No other continent fights itself with this intensity for so long, and it creates states that are fantastically large and capable, that by the end of the 18th century can do things that people would not have considered possible. Now, what these states then also do inadvertently is to actually enforce the letter of the law and assert a monopoly of violence, stamp out dueling, and so forth. So Steve Pinker has done wonderful work collecting all this data, or collating it. Here you see the percentage of deaths from warfare, as we can establish it, for example, from the archaeological record, from prehistoric archaeological sites. And they range from, say, 10 to 60%. And then on the very far right, the blue bars is what you see in modern states. And there, even the 20th century, which was pretty deadly, looks like a rounding error. That's the prehistoric evidence. Then, of course, you have no state societies today that we encountered in the 19th century or more recently. And you see the same pattern. These are death rates for 100,000 people. And again, the rate of violence has dropped off a cliff in the state period. This is what having large, capable states really does. And then you look at homicide rates for England, that's where the data is best, and there's a logarithmic scale on the left-hand side. You can see how horrifically violent life in the Middle Ages was. People constantly took the law into their own hands. So you don't need to go to the Wild West to see people murdering each other regularly. And then it just keeps dropping in the 18th century, 19th century, into the 20th century, except for a small uptick in more recent years. And I don't think we can overestimate how important having capable states is for the development of individualism. Because in order for people to freely contract, there has to be third-party enforcement. Somebody has to step in and say, you're going to honor that contract. And I can only freely choose if I know that this actor is in the background and will make sure that I honor my contract. I can only freely interact with others if I know that I will not be robbed. Or if you think about an extreme example of a state-free society, if you think of Xenophon's March of the 10,000, one of the things he describes is how most of the tribes that he encounters, marching back from what is today Iraq, they say, why shouldn't we kill you? Now, these are Greek mercenaries on the march, and they have ways to defend themselves, but that is the natural reaction of these people. And in addition to having these capable states, there's a second factor that also comes on stream ever more strongly in the last 500 years, and that's the rise of commercial exchange, trade, or as Montesquieu would have said, the civilizing influence of trade. So what this creates is a sort of positive feedback loop where more trade makes you rich, the states also become larger, and in turn it's easier to actually interact commercially. So let me try to wrap things up and put things together. So I think there's some deep roots that make Europe special and create this culture of individualism. And that has something to do with the Catholic Church. It has something to do with Greek antecedents. And on top of that, we have the good fortune of climate change having encouraged people to think for themselves, but basically, as a result of random shocks, systematically destroying the value of tradition, and instead encouraging people to think for themselves. And then on top of that, Protestantism is one of these factors that breaks with tradition. But the main thing it does is it actually creates a tidal wave of religious warfare, which makes states much, much stronger. And this then feeds into economic development, and in combination creates the civilizing influence, reducing violence, and allowing us to listen what Lincoln finally called the better angels of our nature. Thank you.
So there you have it. What we need for an individualistic future is global warming and more warfare. Great. This is turning out really positively so far today. Lizzie here's setting up, I think, some technological magic linking us to France, hopefully, if we're lucky. We're going to have Raicho Bojilov, who's an assistant professor of economics at the École Polytechnique in Paris. Today we've had a lot of stories, mostly, a few numbers, but not many. Mostly it's been stories. Now we're going to get some numbers to back us up here. Raicho's been looking at the data in detail, so if we can get the data transmission to work, we're up? Here we are. Right, Raicho, you're on. Go.
So, thank you for bearing with us, everyone, and Raicho and I will be sort of in tandem navigating, so just saying thank you for bearing with us, and Raicho.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. It's a great honor and pleasure to be part of the conference. But before we start, I would like to apologize for not being able to join you and to thank the conference team and the organizers and the technical support for making possible this presentation on such short notice. The paper that I'm going to present is part of an ongoing research project led by Professor Edmund Phelps and also including Saif Ammous and Gylfi Zoega. The work that we are showing, that I'm presenting today, is indirectly related to Martin Luther and Protestantism. So I believe that before I start, I owe you a little bit of explanation and providing some context. So Luther, the Reformation, and Protestantism have been subject of great interest among social scientists for generations. And in this context, the hypothesis of Max Weber that the Protestant work ethic is not only conducive, but even it might have been instrumental to the development of capitalism, has played a prominent role, both directly and indirectly, on future research in social sciences. So I'm sure that Professor Hans-Joachim Voth has already discussed some of the direct impact on the related empirical literature. And here I would like just to expand a little bit on the indirect effect. The indirect effect has been to stimulate other social scientists to think about the ways beliefs and attitudes affect social and economic outcomes. One such person is Kenneth Arrow, who famously argued that any economic transaction, in fact any economic activity, requires a certain degree of mutual trust. Now this hypothesis has been at the core of a resurgent empirical literature on social trust in the last 10 to 15 years. And the paper that I am presenting today follows in the methodological footsteps of this literature, although we ask slightly different questions. Okay? In particular, we would like to test whether individual beliefs and attitudes about economic life have an impact on individual economic performance and in turn on macro level innovation of countries and therefore productivity. Okay? Before we proceed with our test, we have to address three main challenges. First, we have to identify the main dimensions on which individual beliefs and attitudes vary. To do so, we employ factor analysis and identify two main dimensions of beliefs and attitudes, which we call tentatively modernism and traditionalism. The second challenge is related to reverse causality. Is it the case that people are successful because they hold certain beliefs and attitudes, or is it just the other way around? To address that problem, we adopt the methodological framework proposed by Algan and Kayuk in their paper in American Economic Review published in 2010. And then the third challenge that we have to address is related to the identification of innovation shocks to productivity in a country that can be traced back to the creation of new products, techniques, and technologies within the country itself, rather than the adoption of already existing innovation from abroad. And then finally, we test for a positive relation between inherited beliefs, modernism, and innovation. So, on the slide called Model of Innovation, case with two countries, you're going to see the specification that we take to the data in order to identify innovation generated in a particular country. As you can see, this is an intuitive generalization of the convergence model in economic growth, which I call the Aghion-Nelson-Phelps framework. So here what we have is we have two countries, 1 and 2. Both of them are generating innovation shocks, ETA, and both of them are importing some of the innovation generated by the other country. Note that this framework incorporates some special cases of interest. For example, autarky, in which case there is no convergence to the best practices across countries. Also, this framework incorporates another case, the case of the technological leader. In our context, this is country 1. So, country 1 generates innovation, which defines the world technological frontier, and country 2 catches up to the best practices in the world. Now, we estimate this model using spatial econometric techniques, or factor analysis if you wish. And in this way, we allow for autocorrelation in the innovation shocks for each country, and spatial correlation in the innovation shocks across countries with possible lags. The data that we use for this exercise comes from the Penn-Worrell tables for the period between 1950 and 2013, and the Banque de France, which has generated TFP series that cover a bit longer time span between 1870 and 2013. I think on the slide called Estimates of Annual Indigenous Innovation, you see in the table our results for the period of the IT revolution. That's to say the period between 1990 and 2013. So this table reports the average annual indigenous innovation, average annual imported innovation, and the average annual TFP growth for a set of developed countries. What is interesting to note here is that the US, the UK, and the Scandinavian countries all had very high level of productivity growth in this period, but the composition of this productivity growth varies widely among the countries. So, for example, if we look at Denmark and Finland, we see that these countries, in fact, were quite successful at adopting existing innovation from abroad, and that contributed considerably to their productivity growth. The absolute leaders in indigenous innovation for this period are the United States at the bottom and Sweden. Next, I'm going to move to beliefs and attitudes, and since these results have been partially covered by Professor Phelps in his book Mass Flourishing, I'm going to go over these quite quickly. So we use data on individual beliefs and attitudes from the World Values Survey using the early 1990s and the early 2000 waves. We consider all interview questions about work, bringing up children, role of government, and economic policy. And we apply non-structural factor analysis to these individual level data to investigate a couple of questions. The most striking finding that we have is that about 43% of the variation is captured by two universal or international time invariant indices, which we call index of modernism and index of traditionalism. In particular, the index of modernism reflects a preference to have more initiative at work, reflects a desire to accomplish, to achieve something professionally at the workplace, a preference to teach children to think for themselves rather than just obey authority and parents, and searching for rewards, for rewarding work and for work that allows for greater decision-making freedom. Now, with this, we have accomplished two of the preliminary tasks: the identification of innovation on a country level and the identification of the main dimensions on which beliefs and attitudes vary. Next, I'm going to turn to the relationship between individual beliefs and attitudes and individual economic performance. So if we go to a slide called Innovation, entitled Innovation and Inherited Beliefs, you're going to see the specification that we take to the data in order to generate our so-called inherited beliefs. We postulate that indigenous innovation Y in a given country, C, for a generation T, where a generation lasts for about 25 years, is a function of modernism, some controls, and fixed effects for time and country. The index of modernism itself is a function of, is a weighted average of past or inherited modernism and some innovation due to contemporaneous factors, along with country and fixed effects, country and time fixed effects. Now, this framework raises two main concerns. The first one is that beliefs and attitudes before 1980 are unknown, so we have to use a proxy. Our approach adopts the methodology of Aguillon and Cayuc, and we use data for a panel of American citizens from the Generalized Social Survey, and we try to predict whether the respondents to the questions of the GSS are entrepreneurs who employ more than 10 people, given the information that is available at the time of the birth of those respondents. So this information set includes socioeconomic background, such as the education of the parents, their ethnic origins, ethnicity, religion, siblings, and importantly, the country of origin of their ancestors. We are going to use the estimated country effects, country of origin effects from this regression as instrument for our index of modernism in order to establish the causal relationship between individual beliefs and attitudes and macro level economic performance. The second concern that we are facing is related to the fact that in past modernism and economic performance may be co-determined by a common factor. Okay? For this reason, we consider second, third, and fourth generation Americans born between 1945 and 1970, that's to say basically the baby boomers, and we focus on economic performance after 1990, average economic performance after 1990. The ancestors of these people moved to the US in the years before the First World War, basically between 1850 and 1910. So the estimated country effects are going to be shown on the following slide, which shows a table with the country effects or inherited modernism for the people born between 1945 and 1970. I'm going to focus your attention, in the interest of time, on the first column, which is related to the estimation of the likelihood that the respondents are going to be entrepreneurs who employ more than 10 people. A couple of things to note. The first one is that quite a lot of those country effects, country fixed effects, are statistically significant. The second thing is that people who have ancestors from Anglo-Saxon countries and Scandinavian countries in particular tend to be much more likely to become entrepreneurs. And these results are very similar also if we could repeat the exercise, but this time trying to predict high income. So now we are finally ready for the test. Before we go to the test, we are just going to plot on the following chart the index of modernism on the horizontal axis and the average annual TFP growth for the period 1990-2013 on the vertical axis. So what we see is a positive relationship. It's a strong, positive, statistically significant relationship. We also get such a positive relationship if we go to the next chart, in which we plot the index of modernism against the average annual indigenous innovation. The trouble, of course, here is that the trouble, of course, is that that the index of modernism and the average annual indigenous innovation may be codetermined. They happen at the same time, so we may have reverse causality. For this reason, now we're going to use the estimated country effects on entrepreneurship as an instrument for the index of modernism. And the following charts, two charts, are going to show the results from this exercise. First, we have to see whether there is a positive relationship between the index of modernism and the estimated country effects. So that's on the following chart, which plots, as I said, the index of modernism against the country effects on entrepreneurship. You see that there is a positive relationship. It's a bit weak, but it is statistically significant. Notably here, what we have is that this chart also conforms to the hypothesis that the people who immigrated to the United States had beliefs and attitudes that were representative for the beliefs and attitudes of their home countries at the time when they moved to the United States. Now, finally, on the following chart, you can see the relationship between the country effects of entrepreneurship and the average annual TFP growth. You see that there is a strong positive, statistically significant relationship. It survives if we introduce a couple of institutional variables. But basically what we have is we have a strong positive correlation between the two, and that is also the case if we look at the last chart from the presentation, which plots the country effects on entrepreneurship on the horizontal axis and on the vertical axis, the average annual indigenous innovation. Okay, there we see strong positive significant relation, which is actually quite tight. Okay, so the fit is good. To conclude, what have we done? Okay, we presented a generalized TFP decomposition, which allowed us to identify innovation generated in a country. Then we identified the main dimensions on which beliefs and attitudes vary over time and across countries. And finally, we have shown that the inherited beliefs and attitudes from one's ancestors continue to have significant effect on the likelihood of becoming an entrepreneur and the likelihood of having high income many generations after the people moved to the United States. And finally, we have shown that there is a strong positive relationship between our index of modernism, the measure of indigenous innovation that we have generated, and the estimated country effects from our individual level regressions. Thank you very much, and I'm sorry for going a bit over time.
Thank you, Raicho. I'll keep the introduction of Philip very brief. Philip Howard, founder of Common Good. He's trying to fix the government, and he's now going to respond.
Right, I've been given 2 minutes, but I'll only go 6 over. So what I've learned so far today is that Martin Luther wasn't the only inventor of individualism. Culture matters. Luther was rebelling against authority, obviously, and he also was trying to liberate the individual soul in its relationship with God, not necessarily do all the other things associated with what we consider to be individualism today. What I'd like to do in a few minutes is suggest that individualism, or the idea of individualism and often conflicting beliefs about it, have basically consumed itself. That the idea of individualism is now making it very hard to be an individual. No one's really defined individualism. It's a big topic, and I'm sure there are many definitions. I'm going to suggest 2. There's the do your own thing idea of individualism. This was what George Rupp referred to as unrestrained individualism. Robert Bellow, the sociologist, had an important book in the 1980s called Habits of the Heart, where freedom was defined as he found in suburban California, as the freedom to be left alone. Not the freedom to do, but the freedom to be left alone. I commend to you Kurt Anderson's new book called Fantasyland, about the capacity of Americans to delude themselves. And his thesis, among other things, is that it now includes the freedom to invent your own facts. So the alternative fact universe is this sort of mutation, if you will, of this do your own thing sort of individualism. Whatever you believe is true or true enough, and you can find a community to do that with you. Neil Postman, another sociologist, wrote about this in the 80s in a book called Amusing Ourselves to Death. Someone had a slide with some of the earbuds on and a virtual reality. That's that idea. A second idea of individualism, which I consider to be more substantive, is might be called the freedom to make a difference. Where individuals wake up in the morning, believe that their ideas matter, they can go out into society and actually make things change or make things better, or worse, I suppose, by their own actions. This is the idea, I think, that Weber was writing about a century ago. The idea that Tocqueville was writing about, the barn raisings, the American spirit of go out and do things, make things happen. So that form of individualism is going out into society and working with others to actually accomplish things in the society, whether it's entrepreneurship in the Silicon Valley or in other periods or at other times. Hannah Arendt was writing about both these ideas, and she suggested that freedom, the idea of the free individual, is actually sort of weak tea if you're just doing it by yourself. That individual freedom only has meaning in the context of your social relations with the society around you. The problem with this second idea of freedom is that it requires a coherent theory of authority. You have to have a mechanism for actually making common choices. So, for example, if the school principal does not have the authority to act on your ideas, you, the parent, your ideas don't matter. If you go to the school principal and you say, this would be a better way of doing it, and the response is, the rules won't let me, then you are less free because the school principal is less free. We're not free to have sustainable infrastructure if the governor or the president doesn't have the authority to actually give a permit. If the permitting process goes on for a decade or longer, then we're all stuck in traffic jams, and we can't do anything else. So what's happened in our society is that individualism has mutated into this freedom to be left alone, or freedom to believe whatever you want to, and it's actually defined itself in opposition to the very idea of authority. We're free, we see, and conservatives talk this way, that the authority is a zero-sum game. We're only free if there's less authority somewhere else. And so what we've done is we've actually created a formal structure, and now it's embedded in the culture, designed to do that. There is a rule for everything. Literally thousands of rules beyond any human's capacity to understand them. And if there's any disagreement, there is a right to object for everything, what Francis Fukuyama calls the vetocracy of American government. So we've explicitly created a formal structure designed to guard against authority. The result of this is not that we are more free, but that everyone is stuck in bureaucratic quicksand. We have an entire culture, call it Washington, D.C., subculture, if you will, where people actually think this is the way things ought to work, that nothing can happen. And it's a perpetual, like a Moebius strip. People go round and round and nothing happens, and they make a lot of money doing that. Now, law is supposed to protect us against tyrants and anarchy, such that's, it's an evolution of the Hobbes idea. Hobbes said the ruler would protect us against tyrants or anarchy. Now it's law. The way it's supposed to do that is by setting boundaries. But instead, law has actually become a tyrant. Instead of setting the boundaries, saying people can't break the rules or such, it actually comes into our daily lives and tells my daughter, the teacher, that she cannot put an arm around a crying child. It instructs her how actually to teach a certain class. So there's no inspiration by the teacher, the children get bored and surprised. Schools, public schools, don't work very well. My daughter, by the way, ignores all the rules. There have been studies showing that successful schools have that in common. They ignore the rules. So law has actually replaced our freedom to make a difference. Hannah Arendt also talked about this. At one point she said, the simultaneous recession of authority and freedom in modern society is no coincidence. If you don't have a coherent theory of authority to make common choices, pretty soon people are going to be less free. Now, the reasons behind this are complex. I encourage you to buy all of my books multiple times. Part of it's a kind of a utopian belief in central planning, but the main motivation for why we endure this system is fear of decisions by the other. What if Attila the Hun is principal of the school. Or indeed, Donald Trump is president of the United States. I mean, these things happen. We get bad people. So we've lost, because we're so scared of authority, the most important tool in actually making society work better and giving ourselves the freedom to make a difference. And what we forgot is that authority, the provisional authority to make a decision, is not power to do whatever you want. It's still bounded by law, it's overseen by courts, it's overseen by as many checks and balances as you want, other people who can veto the decision. But the thing you can't do is preclude human responsibility without making everybody, without giving us paralysis and the lack of freedom. Best protection against bad values are good values. It's not the absence of values. We did have bad values, racism and sexism, other things, better values. So here we are in a situation in our society where there's no individual authority, no individual freedom, because there's no authority. The solution, I think, is an entirely new idea, which I sort of think the country is yearning for, entirely new governing philosophy. The philosophy needs to go in the direction of, ironically, what the Catholic Church doctrine calls subsidiarity, which is not federalism. It's not do whatever you want down on the ground, but it's push responsibility to the lowest effective level. You don't have to give up oversight, but law and authority becomes like a distant uncle rather than an instruction manual. People, communities can take ownership for their choices. People can take ownership for the old people living next door. Schools can run in their own way. Teachers can actually use their own inspiration and spirit to teach instead of being pre-programmed, and actually engage people instead of having them burn out, which is what the current system does in the name of individualism. Thank you.